Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day where we're going to be talking a little bit of NFL here and the Jacksonville Jaguars, who just signed Josh Allen to a big-time contract extension. This was reported on Tuesday. Going to be a 5-year deal worth $150 million, at least up to that. $88 million guaranteed. They had franchise tagged him a month ago ahead of the deadline, and now they work out a long-term deal with him. Allen is coming off of a career year where he had 17 and a half sacks. Having that type of a season in a contract year can be a little bit of a red flag at times, but I thought this was a deal they had to do. I love Josh Allen. I think that even headed into this year where obviously 17 and a half sacks is very eye-popping, but I think he has been one of the more underrated edge rushers in the NFL, and now he's sort of finally getting the credit he deserves. He did an interview with the Jaguars media, by the way, and this was right after he agreed to the deal in terms of the point I just made about handing out this type of a contract following a massive statistical year. He just basically talked about how hungry he still is. And yes, I know words are only words, but I think I buy it with him. He said, "I'm extremely blessed and honored to get this paycheck or to get these checks, but I still set goals for myself." Went on to say, "Defensive Player of the Year is my next goal. Winning the Super Bowl, being the MVP of it, I'm a legacy guy." He also said, "I have to win the Super Bowl and be the MVP. I'm not going to stop until I get that. That's motivating me. That's bigger than money." Allen was a first-round pick for them in 2019, 7th overall, and has been an absolute stud for them since then. He's been a key piece of their defense. I do believe that he has played, at least to some degree, a role in making Trayvon Walker's transition into the NFL a little easier. Now, Walker was obviously the first overall pick in 2022, and he was more seen as a little bit more of a project player. And last year, he came back with a very solid season after a pretty quiet rookie year and recorded 10 sacks last season. And I think that the fact that Allen garners as much attention as he does on that defensive front, that frankly was, outside of their defensive ends and it's not the strongest of groups. Their interior D-line wasn't phenomenal, but the fact that Allen exists on that line also allowed Walker to maybe not necessarily be the number one focal point of when opposing teams are game planning. They can't just focus on making things as tough as possible for Walker because they have to worry about Josh Allen as well. And I think that this team is coming along very nicely. That being said, though, the Jaguars did have a disappointing season last year where they went 8-3. They went 8-3 and then lost 5 of their last 6 games and missed the playoffs. Now, I think at least some of that can be attributed to the fact that Trevor Lawrence was dealing with an injury down the stretch of that losing streak, where after going 8-3, the Jaguars faced off against the Cincinnati Bengals on a Monday night game, and they were tied with the Bengals in the fourth quarter when Lawrence went down with a very serious-looking high ankle sprain. He exits that game. They end up losing in overtime. Granted, they did allow 34 points to a Jake Browning-led Bengals team. So, as much as maybe I am trying not to make excuses necessarily for the Jags, but as I do sort of, I guess, let them off the hook a little bit, considering Lawrence's injury, the defense and really the offense as well were just massively inconsistent last year, and that showing against, again, a Jake Browning-led Bengals team was a very tough look, allowing the amount of points that they did. And they tried to force Lawrence back the next week through this high ankle sprain on a short week, which was probably a mistake. Lawrence came out. They ended up scoring 27 points in the game, but Lawrence threw 3 interceptions and really didn't look himself. His mobility was very clearly hindered, and even later in the season as well, he ended up missing a game with a shoulder injury that forced him to miss the game against the Panthers. Now, they ended up winning that game, but were 0-5 in those Lawrence games from there. So, again, a very disappointing end to the season after being one of the most talked about teams in the last offseason, where during the playoffs they pulled off the comeback against the Chargers. They pushed the Kansas City Chiefs and had a real chance. And yes, they did definitely let that one slip away a little bit as Mahomes left that game briefly with a high ankle sprain, I believe it was. But this was a Jaguars team with Trevor Lawrence in his second year were leaps and bounds better than they were the prior season after firing the disastrous Urban Meyer tenure and then going on to the NFL or going into the next season and hiring Doug Peterson as their next head coach. So lots of buzz around this Jaguars team. The playoffs for them, Trevor Lawrence made that big-time jump from year 1 to year 2. They were supposed to have their new star receiver 1 in Calvin Ridley, and their division was supposed to be weak in the AFC South before the Texans came out of nowhere to win 10 games and make the playoffs over them. And the Colts were actually also a competitive team as well, winning 9 games, and they should get Anthony Richardson back next year and in theory be able to improve. Now, could be a chance that a full season of Anthony Richardson does take a little bit of a step back before things get a lot better. Richardson does definitely have the potential, and I am in on him long term, but I wouldn't be surprised, that is, if he does struggle a little bit next season. But all that to be said, can the Jaguars bounce back for next season? I want to start by looking at what they did this offseason outside of this Josh Allen contract extension. They brought in Gabe Davis from the Buffalo Bills. He was probably the biggest addition, of course, the big-time playmaking wide receiver. They gave him a 3-year deal worth $39 million. Very explosive in some of these big-time home run plays. They bring him in, let Calvin Ridley walk, who ended up getting a ton of money from the Tennessee Titans. Ridley was their receiver in yards and was their leading receiver in yards and touchdowns last season. Both he and Davis were sort of inconsistent at times in certain aspects of the game. Like I said, Davis really relied on some of those over-the-top sort of home run swinging plays. Was a big-time touchdown scorer, which is a big deal when it comes to the red zone. They didn't necessarily have anybody who can go up and catch those fade type of routes. He is a good contested catcher, so I think that he can play a nice role in Jacksonville next season. Ridley, for as much as he had, I believe it was 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns, he had more games with 40 yards or less receiving than he did with 100 or more. And I just feel like, especially down the stretch of the season, granted, Trevor Lawrence wasn't necessarily himself either. Ridley probably wasn't worth the paycheck for the Jaguars, who are trying to contend. Now, I didn't hate it necessarily for the Titans, who are resetting, trying to make sure that Will Levis can be a guy for them. But for the Jaguars, I understand sort of letting Ridley walk and coming in with Gabe Davis, who might fit in their system even better, actually. Davis doesn't really have that receiver 1 potential, though, that Calvin Ridley does. And yet again, they just have a lot of very solid options in him, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones. They have Evan Ingram as well, who was top 5 in the league this past season in receptions. They could potentially benefit from adding another wide receiver in the upcoming draft. I wouldn't say it's their biggest need, but is something that I am a little bit curious about as well. On that note, I guess I would say that cornerback is probably their biggest need. They just brought in Ronald Darby, who spent last season with the Baltimore Ravens, and I thought that he did a particularly good job in the matchup against the Texans in the Ravens' first playoff game in the divisional round against the Texans. But still, I feel like that secondary group is a little bit on the weaker side, and they have the 17th overall pick, which is where a couple of these cornerback prospects, specifically, I really like Terrion Arnold out of Alabama. Nate Wiggins is somebody who could be in that sort of range as well. I'm also not sure, though, what the update is on Wiggins and his injury. He ended up leaving the combine after giving a blazing 40 time, ended up leaving with an injury. Wiggins was one of the most improved players in college football from last season to this year out of Clemson. So again, just something I'm sort of looking at for what the Jaguars end up deciding to do in the draft this season. But they also signed Eric Armstead to a 3-year contract worth $51 million. Like I sort of alluded to earlier, the interior of their defensive line wasn't super strong. Felt like Armstead's reputation maybe in San Francisco preceded him a little bit in terms of what types of production he actually put out on the field. But he gets another opportunity here in another situation where there are some big-time edge rushers outside of him in Trayvon Walker and Josh Allen. Hopefully he can sort of re-find some of that energy that he had in the seasons prior, where before his injury he was a big-time game wrecker, and he could prove to be a big addition for the Jaguars this year. And then finally, the last couple moves they made that I wanted to sort of highlight before giving my final thoughts on this are bringing in Buffalo Bills center Mitch Morse in free agency and re-signing Ezra Cleveland, the guard who they traded for from Minnesota at the deadline last year. The offensive line is another area where they could probably work on a little bit. It's fine, it's just not great either, so another area they could address in the draft. But I was very high on the Jaguars headed into last season. I thought that they could have finished as one of the top seeds in the conference, and it looked that way for over the first half of the season, but things really fell apart down the stretch there. And there is a real issue with the consistency. Even when they were still having a good season, there was a couple really concerning games. The first one, and granted this was before we sort of knew how relevant the Texans were going to be last season, the Jaguars ended up getting smoked by Houston in one of the first weeks of the season. They lost that game. It was 37-17. They had the Chiefs game in week 2. That seemed like the Chiefs were just begging the Jaguars to take that one. This was before the Chiefs had really reared its head as the team we ultimately saw in the Super Bowl. But this was a Chiefs team that was really struggling on offense, and the Jaguars just weren't able to get it done on that side. They had a blowout loss to the 49ers a handful of weeks into the season. So I find it sort of hard to imagine the Jaguars are going to be bad once again, but I believe their win total is somewhere around 9.5 games. Now, I think that on paper they should be better than that, and I do believe in Trevor Lawrence. He hasn't necessarily lived up to that very high draft expectation that he had surrounding him as he entered the NFL. A lot of people were saying that he was the best quarterback prospect since Andrew Luck in 2012, and I do think that there are still a lot of positives surrounding Lawrence, and he has tons of weapons around him as well to try and capitalize on that. The roster is very talented, and I think that they should be a playoff team. I think could be a little bit overlooked based off of the noise that the Texans have made both from last season and the offseason this past year. Again, that secondary is somewhere where I look they could definitely address as well. The offensive line has names, and granted, it is a little bit of a situation where we see a lot of the times that these free agent moves don't necessarily pan out the way that we expect. Brandon Scherf, who they got out of Washington in free agency a couple years ago, has not been the all-pro self that he was when he was with Washington. Now they bring in Mitch Morse, who is a very well-respected center in the game. Is he going to be able to keep up his level of play moving forward? All of this is definitely interesting. It's hard to necessarily predict whether or not a team is going to make the playoffs when we're in April. We haven't even had the draft yet. But I do expect the Jaguars to be a good team again. And as long as Trevor Lawrence is actually healthy and playing, I think that they can maybe surprise people more than, and at least overachieve expectations from the way that they are currently really being viewed in NFL fandom. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Follow our socials to get extra content as well. But that is all we have for today. Have a great weekend, and we will see you 2 o'clock Eastern on Monday. We'll see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go.